Hello and welcome to the Business Buying Brit podcast, episode 2. If you're looking to build wealth through buying and operating small businesses, this is the place for you. We'll be telling the stories of men and women who have gone before you, how they've done it, hearing what has gone well, and importantly, what has not gone well. Ultimately, our goal is to learn from their wisdom so that your journey to buying that first business successfully can be accelerated. Today, we have Mr. Mike O'Connor. Mike has most recently purchased 2 companies that do approximately $25 million in revenue and has an impressive past of business startups and real estate investing. Mike, thank you so much for being here today.
James, excited to be here, man. Thanks for having me on the show. Glad to be here.
Thank you. I'd love to start. I know your background was actually quite similar to mine. So you kind of came from the Big Four world as well. So for those that aren't familiar, Big Four it used to be the Big Five, but post Enron, it became the Big Four of the professional services firms. So you've got PwC, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, and KPMG. What drew you there initially? And then you obviously did the similar thing that I did, which is like find your way out of that world. So I'd love to hear a little bit of backstory and what led you to
100%.
kind of leaping into this world of small business investing.
Yeah, absolutely. So getting into the Big Four, and even before Ernst & Young, I was at Capgemini. And if you recall, Capgemini was Capgemini Ernst & Young.
Oh, yes.
Back in the 90s before Enron happened, right? So I was in college. I was a graduate of the University of Georgia, go Dogs. And it was just that typical progression that everyone expects. You go to school, you get a degree, and you go out and try and find the best corporate job you can. And consulting and banking were the two that had the shine around them, right? Everyone was vying for these jobs. They had, the high salary, so to speak, when you're leaving. And so there's this huge pull. So my senior year, I was interviewing with a lot of the companies, Accenture, Capgemini, even interviewed with Ernst & Young off the bat, and got hired by Capgemini. And while it was a great experience at the beginning, you quickly realize that you're there to work. They had me traveling from Atlanta to Alaska to Minnesota to Texas. I was all over the place. And while it was good and I learned a lot, I quickly got uncomfortable and realized I wasn't loving it. So, we can dive into this as much as you want, but I went from there to Ernst & Young. I went from Ernst & Young, I tried a smaller real estate consultancy company. And I quickly realized that the problem wasn't the job, the problem was me, what I was looking for, if that makes sense.
Interesting. So I guess one thing I want to pull out of your story is it appears as though you had this background of like real estate investing as well. Did you start doing that whilst you were still employed in your W-2?
I did, yes. So I started at Capgemini in 2011 when I graduated college. I bought my first rental property in 2013. And at that time, I was still enamored by the corporate world, and I was really enjoying it. But I looked at it as a side investment, right? Here's an opportunity. The market in 2013 in Atlanta was ripe, right? It was still pretty early on for a lot of folks. And so originally it was going to be a passive side investment. So I bought that first house with a partner in 2013. We sat on it for basically a year. And while we didn't self-manage at the time, we were very hands-on, probably more hands-on than our property management company would have wanted. But, we were there doing the repairs, the classic, fix it up, do it yourself. We quickly realized that we really enjoyed this and that perhaps had a little more of a full-time passion for us. So getting into 2014 and 2015, we started scaling it up. And that's when we went and we bought what I would call small-scale multifamily. We bought a 32-unit apartment complex, a 100-unit complex, a 16-unit complex, flipping houses, wholesaling houses. We really got into this. And this is while we had full-time jobs, by the way. And so at that point, we realized, you were in corporate America, right? So you realize, you do your job every day to service your clients, but then in order to move up in the world, you need to work on sales pursuits. You need to go appease that partner or that vice president, right? And you're putting in extra hours. I quickly realized this was more of my passion. And every extra hour I had outside of client service was focused on my side hustle. So that's progression. And what did it for me, I read Tim Ferriss's book, The 4-Hour Workweek.
Yes.
And that just kind of kick-started my desire to have a little bit of this like freedom in my life.
That's great. No, that's great. So I think there's some great lessons here because I think a lot of people would say, look, there's always some limiting factors on whatever job you've got. And actually, like the client service model, like it's long hours. You said you traveled a lot. despite the limiting factors that your specific job gave you, you still found a way to do something on the side. You're just kind of putting the building blocks. Like looking back, I'm sure it's kind of obvious that became the foundation, of like slowly chipping away.
Correct.
And I think it's easy for me to pull that point out because part of my story as well, like, was just slowly like adding rental properties, and I didn't know what the future was going to be, but doing that has actually created that platform that made the leap much easier further down the road. So would definitely want to highlight that for people listening.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's always time in the day, right? So to me, this was not only a passion investment, it was a hobby, right? So while people were out, watching football at night, or, I was in my 20s, like going out to the bars on the weekends, I was looking at real estate. I was investing in real estate. I was underwriting deals, talking to brokers. I just poured myself into it, and thankful that I did, because I'm sure we'll get into it. That's what led me into the businesses that I started in the home services space and kind of built the foundation.
Right. So what I think is cool. And one final point on that, just thinking about it, because I know when you've got a really busy career, it can feel like you have 1 week where you've got a client deadline and you just flat out the whole time, and you can beat yourself up essentially that I haven't made progress on my investing goals. But I think just taking just the tiniest of steps, like every day or every week,
correct,
that compounds, and it really does. So you've got to give yourself grace on the weeks where you have those big deliverables or patience or whatever it is.
Oh yeah.
And keep moving forward.
You have to start somewhere. Yeah, you're not just going to go and own a 100-unit apartment complex. Right. Like that takes time. You have to build up to it, and you're exactly right. Whether it's hopping into places like Bigger Pockets or networking with local real estate groups, like the smallest of activity. You never know who you're going to meet, what you're going to read, or who you're going to come across.
That's so true. So true. So what I think is really cool about your story is, so we've talked a little bit about the career. It wasn't for you. You started doing some of this real estate stuff. Well, the first businesses you actually got into outside of that, they weren't actually purchases, which we'll get onto your business purchases shortly. But actually, the first things you did, you started companies that supported your real estate, right? So I believe it was property management,
correct,
like some construction and maybe a landscaping company there as well.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah. So, I realized we had this opportunity in front of us, right? We were buying all of this real estate. And so in my particular case, what was right in front of me was, I think at our peak, we had around 200 units between single family and multifamily. And the first thought that my partner and I had was, we know this business really well. We understand it. We are the investors. We are the owners. We care about it, right? And our property management company was never really living up to our expectation. At this point, we had our real estate license just because we wanted to have it. We thought it might help us go out and acquire deals. And it did in some instances. And so we quickly talked about, should we bring this in-house, right? We have all of this right in front of us. Like, we could literally flip the switch and have a property management company tomorrow, right? And so that was the first thing we did. We took over our units. We took over the Atlanta-based ones first. So that was the 32 unit and the 16 unit, and then slowly brought the rest in-house because it was right in front of us, right? Like, why not go out and do that? It was more cost-effective. It was an out, and we still had our jobs, by the way. So this was an avenue to getting out of our jobs because it was starting to bring in, or at least preserve cash flow. And then we started going out, and I can talk however we want to go into how we started marketing ourselves as a third party and built that platform up. But we use the property management as the first of the few businesses.
That's great. And so I know with property management, you need not just, you talked about license, but there's actually an affiliate broker license and a broker license, right? And my understanding is you need the broker license to do the property management as an actual company outside of your own rentals.
That's correct. So we actually brought in another guy who had his broker license. And we eventually bought him out. It was kind of agreed upon at the very beginning that, hey, you're going to come in, help us for a little bit until we can get our broker's license. We did that. The time came. We bought him out, paid him for his time, so to speak, and then brought it all in-house. And then, I'm sure we're going to get into this, but the cool thing about property management, having all of this real estate in front of you, is there are so many side businesses that you can then shoot off, right? You have all this in front of you. There's so much construction that takes place. Toilets break, roofs need to be replaced, units need to be turned, right? Lawns need to be cut, landscaping needs to be done. And so once we really got our property management figured out, actually the first thing we did was starting to go out and doing third-party management, right? Just people knew us as investors. Our whole model was or we are investors first, right? We're not just a property management company that spun up. We are guys who know how to run a P&L in the real estate space. So once we started bringing those folks in, we started looking at, we would go through our P&L, where are we spending the most money? The first thing was construction. We created a construction company. We started handling the turns. We started handling make-readies, toilet leaks, toilet breaks, all of the above. Where's the next bucket? Landscaping. We took that in-house. And so we vertically integrated, so to speak, over the course of about.
I love that. So you basically looked at where the opportunity was. So it was very systematic. It wasn't kind of scattergun like, oh, these could all help us maybe.
No, yeah.
It was like, this is our biggest line item of expense. Could we find,
Correct.
Create a business that actually services us? And you kind of did it that way.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, we looked at everything, right? So I kid you not, we would look at our monthly P&L every single month and say, where do we spend the most money? And we would say, no conversation is a bad conversation. So we talked about our legal bills. Like, is there a way for us to spin up like a legal arm? And we decided there's too much regulation, red tape. Like, we don't want to touch that. So like, that's an example of one where we'll just let sleeping dogs lie. But the obvious ones just pop out right in front of you. And then the other aspect of it was we had a little brokerage that we spun up. We had our license. So we brought a couple agents underneath us that helped transact and buy real estate for these other investors that would then feed the machine that is the property management, the landscaping, and the construction. So
honestly, that's great. I guess, so my follow-up question to that is, given this journey of building these things, was there like an inflection point where you suddenly said, like, I now have enough money to leave my job? Like, was that scary? How did that feel? And like, was it pre-planned, or did you just get to there and you're like, actually, I think I could leave?
Yeah. And, I was at a point there where I was 26 or 27. I didn't have kids yet. I had a wife who worked, ironically enough, she's at the Big Four as well. That's how we met. And so in my situation, I know not everyone had that. There was a little bit of a safety net, right? But at this point, yes, I was making enough cash flow through my businesses. Again, on the side, we would flip some houses, we would wholesale some houses. So we had some like secondary income coming in, so to speak, and plus that safety net. And I'll never forget the day my boss came in and told me that, and I was talking to my wife a little bit about wanting to do this. And I can be a little impulsive at times. My boss came in, we were good friends. He's like, hey, we got to schedule your mid-year review. And I remember I just looked at him from my desk and I said, you know what, I actually need to talk to you about something. And he's like, come to my office. So went down to his office. I put in actually a 6-week notice and haven't looked back ever since. St. Patrick's Day of 2017, I believe.
Oh, wow. Today. That's great. And I'm sure that was still pretty scary doing it.
It was, right? Because at a W-2, you know exactly every single month what is coming in and what is not. The minute that you go off on your own, it is an unknown. And, you are the maker of your destiny. I think something that's important for your listeners to realize is that being an entrepreneur to me brings more security because you are in control of your own destiny. When you have a W-2, people say, oh, this is secure. I have a 401k. I know I'm getting paid. Someone else is in charge of your life and your financial house. And that is a scary thing. So it took me a little while to get comfortable with it. I had a couple months where I made less than I did in the corporate job, but very quickly that was exceeded, and you really haven't looked back since.
Yeah, what I often hear from people, and I can relate to this as well. Like, you make the jump, and that handing a notice in is a scary moment, but you've got to at some point back yourself and just go for it. But then there's this weight. Correct. Because you've just said you had employees and people who work for you. It's like you leave the W-2 into this new world, and yeah, the upside looks phenomenal looking forwards in the new world. Right. But there's this perceived risk, but there's also the weight you carry, almost as like, I've got to continue to service payroll, look after these people. And I mean, for me, that was definitely a transition. I had to get used to that, even though it kind of looked good on paper. And I've heard that story like time and time again with other people, like learning to feel like it feels different being a business owner full-time versus a W-2.
100%. And you realize quickly, to your point, that people are relying on you, right? You are providing the W-2 to other people. So you have to think beyond just yourself. You can't be selfish anymore, right? You got to take care of your people and protect them. And that's immensely important. And kind of talking about the people side, I'll kind of hit on what I'm doing now. We can kind of go back to the acquisitions. We were heavy into outsourcing before outsourcing was really a big thing. Like we were able to scale so quickly because we used a lot of outsourced help. The quality is phenomenal and the cost is about 30% of what's in the United States. So talking about continuing to vertically integrate. We took our experience that we had scaling our businesses using outsourced help and have now leveraged that into what I'm doing now, full time, which is helping other people do the same thing. So it's just, I'm big on seeing opportunities right in front of you, realizing what you're really good at, and then just pouring gasoline.
With outsourced help, like I can see how it would help with certain industries, but are you seeing outsourcing being a real key lever for business owners, to take advantage of, kind of across the board? Are there certain areas you would avoid using outsourced help in? Or there's some areas where you're like, it should always be accounting and like customer service or, something like that?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of different ways to go on that, James, just because I'm big that it can be done in a lot of different areas, right? I like to focus on what I call back office operations solely. I don't like to get into the sales roles. I don't love doing cold calling roles. There's a high burnout rate. But what small and medium-sized business owners, let's call that 50 or below employees, need to realize, and especially for people that are looking to get out and need help but don't think they can afford it, accessibility to outsourcing is very there for them. It's not just the JP Morgans and the Wells Fargos of the world who've set up big, call centers, overseas. This is accessible to people, and the quality is extremely high. So you can go up and stand up a business and hire the talent that you need to scale your business to the next level much quicker and much easier than you would perhaps imagine. So, the term that always gets thrown out there is VAs. People just think, oh, I can hire a VA to do my calendar or do my email. Yes, you can do that, but you can have them in specialty roles. We hire civil engineers who are doing construction estimates and takeoff, right? Paralegals, data research entry. So the opportunities are endless. So, people looking into starting a business or scaling your business or, to your point, buying a business, one of the coolest levers is you look at that P&L, payroll is one of the biggest expenses, right? There is such high quality talent outsourcing that immediately drops more to the bottom line, which opens up, businesses that make sense to acquire.
Right. That's a great point. When I so I teach this, how to buy a small business, and so I talk about the buy box. I have a very defined buy box. It's got 9 or 10 criteria in it, but one of the things is kind of low hanging fruit and things that you see that we don't advocate going in and immediately changing things, but like maybe 100 days in, you could start making changes. So, like maybe a business hasn't increased their prices through COVID at all, and their cost base has increased, or, it's really possible these days. It sounds impossible, but when you get into the space, it happens all the time. You can buy businesses without websites even. Like these things are like, oh, it's a simple marketing, expense, very cheap, and it helps us. So I think outsourcing is a good one to add in there. It's like, maybe, a few months in, it's possible to not necessarily, replace people existing unless people are just underperforming. But in terms of scalability and growth, like we could grow in a much more profitable way by adding people from, using outsourcing.
Correct. 100%. You're right. You don't want to go and shake the tree too much the first 100 days or, even the first, 6 months, right? You really need to go in and grab your arms around what it is that you just bought or took over and understand the business before you start making changes.
That's great. So this is a perfect segue to now talk about business acquisition, which is the topic I love. Yes. So you are an owner of 2 companies that do about $25 million a year in revenue, and they're in the firearms space. And I would love for you to just give us a bit of a walkthrough on how that came about. I know that there's a partnership involved, so we're big on partnerships here, because often we always talk about it's better to do this journey with other people and go the distance of people that you want to be friends with in 20, 30 years time from now, rather than take on all this weight and stress yourself. So would love to hear the story, how it came about, how you structured it, and kind of if you're willing to share like what you paid for it.
Yeah, 100%. So let's think. It was back in 2020, and this is going to go back to my Capgemini days now. So there was my boss, many levels up, who I always had a really good rapport and relationship with. And sharp guy. He's an ex-Navy SEAL. He ran for a political position in the state of Georgia, ended up losing, tried to go back to Capgemini, kind of got ousted, right? He was at that senior level leadership where you're gone for a little bit, like it's tough to come back. And he had this point where he was like, what am I going to do now, right? Like I don't want to necessarily go back to consulting. And so he had this idea that he wanted to go out and start buying small and medium-sized businesses. And so him and I started chatting. And his brother-in-law was the CEO of a large firearm company that's based out of Atlanta, Georgia. And so he kind of had inroad on any type of transaction that could come across their desk that they would pass on because it was either too small, didn't fit their model, whatever. This was a $100 million company, right? And they focused on hunting rifles. And so they would pass on a lot of things that related to, handguns or other things related to that. And I'm not a big gun guy. I don't have any type of serious passion for it. But an opportunity came across his brother-in-law's desk that was too small for them. The size of the business at the time was they were asking around $10 million for the business. And what's interesting about the firearm space is you get a lot of guys who are tinkerers, right? People who create this cool thing in their garage or in their workshop. They have a couple of buddies who try it. Oh, they think it's cool. And then before you know it, they have this product. Before you know it, they have this company. Kind of like you mentioned earlier, James, where you can buy a business that doesn't have a website or any sophistication to it. There's a ton of that in the firearm space. And so, without boring you on the specific details, the opportunity came across our desk. We were competing with another buyer for this space. There's this guy who owned and founded this company in early 2000s. It's called Lone Wolf Distributors. They make Glock parts and accessories. And it was just ripe for opportunities. The original representations, they were misrepresenting their revenue and their margins and their budgets. And so the price quickly went from 10 million to 6.5, which is where we executed the deal at. And to your point earlier about taking this business over, then I'll kind of stop and let you ask some questions. There were so many things within this business that we could do. Their ERP system was messed up. Their website was from, the Stone Age. They hadn't increased their pricing in ages. We literally could go in and do a 20% increase on prices day one. The sophistication of the team wasn't there. They weren't maximizing on product lines. And so there was just so much opportunity for us to go in and shake it up, but we had to do it kind of
Right. Okay, that's good. So you executed at 6.5 million. What was the earnings, like EBITDA, approximate?
They drop around 12% to 15% to the bottom line. Now, what's interesting, and we can get into this, the firearm market's been extremely soft the last year and a half. So a lot of firearm companies are struggling right now, right? Including ours. We're actually doing much better than the average, but in a normal, healthy environment, you're dropping around 12 to 15% to the bottom line. And so that was the first of the two.
So that would be kind of 12 to 15% net income. Okay.
Correct.
Okay. And then with the partnership that you had with this guy, are you 50-50 or are there additional partners in there as well?
No, there's additional partners in there as well. So I'm in the high teens for this ownership structure. We brought in some additional capital in the back end. So there's 3 of us that are on the personal guarantee, like the on the hook for the big stuff. And then we got a bunch of small minority owners that we brought in as well.
Okay, so you've got a slightly more complicated ownership structure.
100%. We have Class A shares, Class B shares. We went out and took a loan for the business. We raised $2.5 million of the total transaction. We have people who own like 3% of the business, right? We've got some strategic players who own a small amount that we want to have in because it's a very heavily regulated space and there's a lot about who you know in certain areas. And so having the right people in place, so to speak.
Okay, so what would you say to someone who just listened to that complicated ownership structure and is kind of overwhelmed by that? Because I can see how you've been in the business world, putting deals together, starting and running companies for a long time. So it's like you've just moved from here to here, in terms of putting together that capital structure. But like someone starting new, that's kind of overwhelming for them. So what advice would you have to someone who's wanting to buy a business, doesn't really know how to go about it? You've clearly got a lot of partners here. So how does someone find a good partner to do this with?
100%. So just to mention that we have had bigger aspirations. Like this was acquisition 1 of what we thought was many. So we way overcomplicated it at the very beginning, right? We did make another acquisition after that. So you don't need to get nearly as complicated as what we did. And I would say if you're going in and buying a business for the first time, going in and buying a business for $6.5 million isn't necessarily the size. Perhaps it is, right? But if you're buying even a smaller business, you don't need to have too complicated of a structure. I'm big on partnerships, and historically I've had a 50-50 partner on things that I've done. And I've always thought it was really important to find someone who complements your skill sets and brings what I call healthy conflict to the situation. If you are in an echo chamber where it's yes, 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 and everyone just agrees with the first thought that comes to mind, I find that to be pretty unhealthy. I always talk to my business partner and say, if we're not pissing each other off every so often, like we're not pushing the boundaries and causing enough friction. And so the advice I would give to people that are starting businesses, if they're looking for a partnership, is find someone who is frictional with you, who complements your skill sets, and that'll help you think through things properly and methodically and ultimately get you to the right decision. Now, as far as the actual structure of that goes, I would make sure you are still very buttoned up, right? I would talk to an employment attorney, or not an employment attorney, a legal attorney who focuses on putting together entities and LLCs, and I would put it together with the rainy day scenario in mind, right? Think about the worst case scenario and plan for that, hoping that never becomes an issue. And then depending on what your vision for the business is, if you do want to make it larger in scale, provide yourself the flexibility within that operating agreement to flex up should that be what you guys want to do.
That's a great point. So one of the things Mike's referring to is the operating agreement, and then often within that you can have a buy-sell agreement, which forms part of it. So it basically sets out on the front end, what happens in the event of death, divorce, whatever you want, like falling out. How does one person buy the other party out, and what happens to the business? So I think that's really wise, sound advice to think about on the front end, even if you are like best friends with the person you end up starting with. But I like the healthy conflict. I haven't heard that before. Like, look for someone who you can have healthy conflict with. I think inherently that's in my partnerships, but I hadn't actively gone out to look for that. But I think that's a great point.
Yeah, if you're not complaining to your wife at dinner about something that you and your business partner did sometime over the last month, like I mean it, like you are not pushing the boundaries enough, and you can find yourself in a dangerous situation as far as just jumping into something that you shouldn't be doing.
Okay, I like that a lot. So we like partnerships. 50-50 is good, and you think that was kind of overcomplicated your deal, but maybe it made sense given the regulation of things. But for most people, like maybe don't go that complicated. So that's some good summaries. So exactly. In terms of like actually then taking hold of this business and growing it and operating it, who manages the day-to-day? Have you hired a company manager?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'll kind of jump ahead a little bit and then back into what your question is. We went and did an asset purchase agreement with another company called Primary Weapon Systems. They make larger firearms. And here was a company that was close to being insolvent, right? So we basically provided them a debt loan, had a whole bunch of different milestones that this business needed to hit for us to then convert that debt into equity. And we got it for cheap. I think it was a couple $1 million that we purchased this company for, plus working capital, plus using our personnel, our staff, our team. At that point, our business was large enough, right? That company was doing about $15 million, right? To then bring in some sophisticated leadership. So my partner that I mentioned, who had the idea to go on his own, he was running the business as the CEO on a day-to-day basis. And to the prior owner's credit, they had some really good strategic people in place, specifically in like the product vision market, right? They were really good about visioning and engineering cool products, really bad on executing it, right? Like if you send a bunch of firearms off to production and they're off by like the smallest millimeter on your drawings, you get a bunch of sendbacks, which makes manufacturing and scale really challenging, which makes your margin management really challenging. And so there's a lot of stuff there that we need to tighten up. But to answer your question, what we ultimately did was we were able to go and we hired his brother-in-law, the CEO from the other company who originally brought us this deal, and he's now our acting CEO. So he's kind of the grown-up in the room now, the guy who's been in the gun business for 20 years, who has experience running a really large company. And he's just very methodically going down the list of things that we're both deploying as new products, buying new machinery, how we go about implementing our ERP system, and he is running the show and has made some awesome strategic hires underneath him.
Love it. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. And then how much time do you personally spend in the business now?
On this one, this is one that I'm not in. I sit on the board. So I'm one of 5 board members. I would say I probably put in maybe an hour a week on it, just more from a strategy point of view, right? At the very beginning, I was more hands-on. And the idea was this was always going to be an investment into a business that I would have my hands on at the beginning and then go and find an operator, which is, to the people that listen to the show, that is one method, right? Go and buy a business, operate it for a little bit, and then hand it off to someone else. At the very beginning, I was very hands-on with like pricing modification, right? So to my point earlier, they were so underpriced on their all of their SKUs. I mean, I'm talking thousands of, I went through a list of thousands of things that we have sold over the course of the years. Every single thing just needed to be marked up. I was in there helping with our marketing plan, ERP implementation, and everything in between. At this point, it's more making strategic decisions that I have.
Okay, that's great. So I see that quite often, actually. It's like you jump in and you may have to be, whatever your skill set is, you're kind of involved in the early days. But then if you're truly buying as an investment, you don't want to have a job you're not getting paid for. So then you hire people that are better at the job than, what you or I could do. So like I hire a specialist in this area or this area, and then you kind of elevate yourself to that investor level where you oversee. And it's never really true, from my experience anyway, it's never truly passive. You're still like there, you still have to have your finger on the pulse, but you can at least use your time day to day to do other things.
Yeah, and I'm big on taking something over, and I'm big on this because I've learned my lesson. I've been burned in buying into businesses where I didn't do this, but I'm big on going in and having your hands on it in some capacity or another, right? Like really understanding what makes the thing tick, because then you can do two things. You can provide the strategic oversight to whoever's operating it, and then more importantly, you can be way more intentional about finding the right person to be running it. Like if you know what the inner workings are and the strengths and weaknesses that you need in an operator, that helps you find the right person that will lead to your success. And if you don't do that, I'm not saying that you'll have a problem. You could very well do just fine, but it adds an element of risk.
Makes total sense. Okay, so I want to move on to, and let me give you some context. On this show, we care a lot about learning from mistakes. And that's, we just believe in not having an ego. We like to help one another, and also we all make mistakes. However, tightly you keep things together, or like paint a picture of being perfect on the outside. We've all made loads of mistakes in business. So what I would like for you to share with the listeners is, like, if someone could listen to your story and say, this man has had success after success after success, what are some maybe mistakes that you wouldn't mind sharing with the audience along the way? I think that would really help the audience, and just to hear that people with a resume and a career in investing portfolio like you still go through normal people stuff.
100%. And I'm big on that too. Sharing, I think you can learn more from the failures than you can the successes, and people like to focus too much on the successes at times. Was it 2021? I went out and I invested a little too passively into two different businesses, and both of them were franchise businesses, by the way. I'm not saying that is the reason for this, but that was a commonality. I invested in a concrete company, so concrete repair, concrete driveways, foundation type work, as well as a quick lube oil change. Think of it wasn't Take 5. I think of like a Take 5 quickie, Jiffy Lube type concept. And both of these businesses looked phenomenal on paper, right? Franchisors, and I won't mention which one they are. I don't want to, disparage them, but franchisors are required to publish something called an FDD that outlines their financials, the success of their stores, the cost of capital it takes to acquire and get them up and running. And both of these places looked phenomenal on paper. And so literally simultaneously, I went pretty heavy into both of them. I brought 3 territories in the concrete space and 10 territories in the quick lube space. And very quickly did I realize, not only was this painful, but I also didn't know what I was doing in these spaces, right? Like concrete a little bit, because it's in that kind of blue collar, somewhat tangent to home services, but I knew nothing about the the quick lube space, nor did I have a partner in my group that knew it, right? Like in the firearms, I knew really nothing about the firearms, but I had experts in the room with me who really understood it. And so, I spent a good bit of 2021 and even last year really rolling my sleeves up trying to get these things profitable. And I just couldn't do it. So I've recently thrown the towel in on both of those opportunities. And I've lost a significant amount of money in the process, right? I'm on the hook for 15-year leases on a couple places that I've got to work on subleasing, right? Like that monkey's not off my back yet. I've had to restructure partnership agreements. It causes tension within your group, right? It took my eye off the ball on things that were working well, right? So it was like a double-edged sword, or a double whammy, so to speak. You're taking your eye off the ball of things that are making you money that you know really well. You're pouring cash into something else, so your income drops a little bit, your cash outlay increases, and it's a tough spot to be in. With that being said, if you're an entrepreneur and you plan on going out and buying businesses and acquiring them, I'm not saying that you're going to be making big mistakes, but like you're gonna miss sometimes. So, I think you said this earlier, James, like give yourself some grace in doing this and realize not everyone's perfect. And you see all these people out there on social media, especially these business influencers who talk about how awesome their portfolio is and how everything is perfect and rosy. If you're in there doing nitty gritty, you're getting knocked in the chin every day. It's just a matter of how you deal with it and rebound, and if you learn from your mistakes.
It's so true. There was a period a few months ago where a few just issues came up in one of our businesses, and I was telling my wife, like, it just feels like I wake up, I go to work, I get punched in the stomach. That's my job,
Yeah.
But I think first of all, thanks for your vulnerability in sharing that. I think there's real strength in sharing some of the things we haven't done well. And I mean, how do you deal with that? Because I know that kind of knock can knock a lot of people out and just take them out of the game completely. Like, you are still here, you're still charging forward, you've still got several other successful investments going ahead. Like, how do you section that in your brain and be like, okay, well, just because something I did was a failure doesn't mean I'm a failure. I'm going to keep going.
Yeah. It's putting your ego aside, right? To your point earlier, it's putting your ego aside and realizing that you're not going to win on everything, right? I mean, you look at using a sports analogy, right? Like a Hall of Fame batting average is, 333, right? 33%. And you probably want to do a little better than that in fitness investing, but you're not going to win every time. And if you just realize that you learn from your mistakes, you take it as a positive, you look back on the things and you're being truly honest with yourself. How did I get myself in this situation? And you truly, you're not just sugarcoating it or blaming someone else or blaming the market or blaming the franchisor. You look at, why am I, Mike O'Connor, in this situation right now? It's going to make you better in the future. So I view it as an opportunity, right? Like, yes, it sucks that I lost all this money, but I call it like my street MBA for the last few years, right? Got knocked in the chin. I'm going to take those learnings and I'm going to grow and I'm going to be better. I'm going to perform my other businesses better. I'm going to make better investment decisions when I acquire my next one. I will be in a much better spot now. And I'm glad it happened now, at 34 than when I was maybe 54 and the stakes were higher, right? Perhaps the businesses were bigger, the losses were more, I had more at stake. So there's a lot of positive that comes in the negative aspects.
Yeah, that's so true. Street MBA, or what's it? You either earn or you learn.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, with that, Mike, I just want to say thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Where can people find out more about you and your companies?
Yeah, if you were to follow me find me at Mike at nexuspt.io. Shoot me an email. I'll be happy to get back in touch with you. I'm on LinkedIn as well. My company website is Mike at nexuspt.io. All of those will lead you back to me. So I'd love to hear from anyone. Love to talk to them about, what's gone well, what hasn't gone well, and would be glad to be a resource for anyone else.
Thanks so much, Mike.